You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
If you are a regular listener to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, then maybe you remember a few weeks ago when our guest was Clint Lacy, and we talked about the Ball Knobbers, that infamous Missouri Ozark outlaw gang. Or maybe you remember a few weeks before that when Clint was our guest, and we talked about his great book, Blood in the Ozarks. Well, after our last discussion on the Ball Knobbers, of course, I wanted to continue picking Clint's brain, but unfortunately, we were out of time. We only have an hour to work with in each broadcast. So rather than hanging up the phone with Clint, what I did was I kept him on the line, and then we continued our discussion, and we talked about Jesse James. I mean, how in the world could you grow up in Missouri like Clint did and not have a profound interest in Jesse James? And obviously Clint does, and he did grow up with that interest. Not only that, in the Barnes Review magazine here, on different occasions, Clint has written articles about Jesse James, the most recent being about how Jesse had faked his death. And so Clint and I had a discussion, and we talked about Jesse James, and we kind of related it to some modern day politics and the overall politics of the war between the states. And I believe it was a great conversation, and I believe that you'll enjoy listening to it. So without any further introduction, let's go ahead and talk about Jesse James.
Okay.
So, of course, you've lived your whole life in Missouri, and so I can see why you would have been drawn to the Ball Knobbers. But how in the world do you live your whole life in Missouri and not be drawn to Jesse James?
When I was growing up, there are always wild stories. Either everybody was related to Jesse James, or Jesse James used to hide out in that cave over there. Mm-hmm. There were always stories circulating, and it was pretty much impossible not to be involved or hear about it or speculate about it.
Right. Well, I've been working on a book on Jesse James since, about 2004. So that's, 14 years now. And I'm no further along in it than I was 14 years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I'm considering doing is writing it not as a historical work at all. Because then I'd have to footnote the whole thing, and that's a lot of work. I'm thinking of just writing it as a novel.
Well, that would be good, too.
Yeah, this is my interpretation of Jesse James. This is the life that I think that he lived. And you can accept it or you can reject it. If nothing else, hopefully they enjoyed reading it.
I would enjoy reading it. I don't know. Is anybody? I don't think anybody's really taken that approach, have they?
Well, there was a book that I read back, 10 years or so ago now. And I believe I was in Missouri when I was reading it, although I may have been in Arkansas. But I had picked this book up at, of all places, a yard sale. And I took it with me on a trip, and I was reading it. I was speaking. I want to say I was speaking in a church in Missouri for a week of revival meetings, but I may have been in Arkansas that week. But the book was written by Mark Twain. And the story, or the behind the writing of the book itself, was that in the 1980s, Mark Twain's literary agent had been long dead, but the house that he had lived in had stayed in his family through a couple of generations, and his descendants sold the house. And when they sold the house, the new owner was up in the attic, and he was cleaning some things out, and he saw all of these old manuscripts and all of these old documents. Some of them were handwritten, some of them were typewritten, and he thought that there might be some value to them. And of course he knew, some of the history of the house, and that the gentleman who had been the literary agent to Mark Twain and some other people had lived in that house for a number of years. And so he calls the University of Missouri, and they basically take possession of all of these documents, and they authenticate them as manuscripts to Mark Twain books. Some of them had been published, some of them had not. And this presumably was Mark Twain's last novel. And it was published as such in the 1980s. And the story that Mark Twain tells at the beginning of the book is that he's getting off of a riverboat. And he's basically abducted, and he's whisked to a hotel. And his abductor then identifies himself as Jesse James. Of course, this was some 15 years after Jesse had supposedly been shot by the dirty little Howard, or the dirty little coward, Mr. Howard. And so Jesse James, presumably, begins to tell him how he had faked his death and how, he thought that he was the best that had ever been at what he had done. And so he wanted his true story to be told by the best writer that ever was. And so Twain, having his ego picked a little bit, decided, well, okay, I'll hear this guy's story. And for 3 days, Jesse James, or this person who claimed to be Jesse James, tells Mark Twain this elaborate story of how he faked his death and how he ended up going out west. And Mark Twain wrote about it. And the historians and the literary critics of our day, their response to that is that Mark Twain was an excellent writer who knew just enough contemporary history to write a convincing piece of fiction. But yet, when I read the book, it's like, well, everything makes sense now, because I looked at Jesse James's death. The body was too short. His teeth were eaten up with tobacco stains, whereas the real Jesse James never drank or smoked a day in his life. There were too many variations that never made sense. And the Mark Twain version even explains how the body that was exhumed in 1995 and the DNA test was done to it, how it could have been Zerelda James's son, but not have been Jesse. Because Jesse had a half-brother who was actually the one who was rolled up in a carpet in the middle of the night after he had died of consumption, and his body was brought up north, and the Ford shot it in the back and turned it in for the reward and so forth. And of course, I know you've written at length on Jesse and how he faked his death, and that's really what we're going to talk about. And I'll let you fill in the details, and some of them may be the same, and some of them may be totally different. And I don't even know how we got on the subject of this Mark Twain book now, but
No, but you piqued my interest.
Okay.
It's a good jumping in point, because a lot of my information that came for this article in the Barnes Review about Jesse faking his death came from a gentleman by the name of Ron Pastor. Pastori. I can't remember how he pronounces it. He was living in Kansas in the early 90s, and he took over this ranch or this farm and kind of turned it into a little tourist thing. But when he took over this farm, there was a cave on it. People had told him about this cave. And the entrance to the cave had JJ carved in it, facing opposite sides. And his daughter was little then, and she said, "What does that stand for?" And he kind of jokingly said, "Jesse James." Well, he had heard about the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was the Knights of the Golden Circle was instrumental in helping to influence secession throughout the South. And after the war, it turned to storing gold and silver in various parts of the South and West. And the plan was to use it to resurrect the Confederacy someday. So his story originally started on the Knights of the Golden Circle, but what he uncovered was evidence to prove that Jesse James faked his death. Now, there's a lot of people that are descendants out there who'll get mad even at the mention of this, and I don't know if they're mad because they think it's fake or because they won't be related to him anymore. But anyway,
I think they've got a good little money-making business going on, and they don't need that to be disrupted.
Right.
Nor do they need a whole other group of descendants somewhere else that could have to share the money with them.
Well, what Pastore found was there were 3 Jesse Jameses. All 3 were cousins. And one had been robbing trains and banks, saying he was the Jesse James gang. And Ron Pastore's belief is that all the robberies the James gang did was for the Knights of the Golden Circle. A man by the name of Bob Brewer wrote a book called Rebel Gold. Before it was published under that title, it was published under the title Secret Sentinel. And Bob Brewer, his grandfather, was a sentinel in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. And he recalls growing up, his grandpa would show him different signs on trees and stuff, and give him a little bit of what it meant, but not the full picture of it. And I believe one time Bob Brewer said he needed a car as he got older, and his grandpa said, "Give me a few days." And a few days later, he came back with the money. But according to Pastore's research and Bob Brewer's research, these hidden caches of gold and silver were throughout the South and in Kansas, and some of it even made its way as far as Arizona. And each location of where this gold and silver was buried had a loyal man guarding it. And his job was to protect it until either the Confederacy was reborn or until he could pass it on to somebody else to protect it. And Mr. Brewer recalls, he was of age when the Vietnam War started and when the draft kicked in. He knew he was going to get drafted, so he opted to join the Navy, volunteer. And he remembers his grandfather was incredibly saddened when he did this. No doubt because his grandfather was planning on making him the next sentinel for the cash, the gold and silver cash. Bob Brewer retired out of the Navy and returned to Ouachita, the Ouachita Mountains, Arkansas. And he actually cracked the Knights of the Golden Circle code of what all of these symbols and letters and things of that nature meant. They're all guides to tell you how to find the gold and silver cache that had been hidden away. And he actually found his grandfather's gold and silver cache, the one he was guarding. He said he didn't take any money out of it because I guess he felt like he would be betraying his grandfather. But he said there was a lot of it, and he already found enough. I forgot what they called them, but they were more or less paychecks, if you will, stored in jars in various areas close to these gold and silver caches. And it was your payment for guarding the main cache of gold and silver. And there were several of them around. That's how his grandfather bought the car for it. Mm-hmm. He actually, like I said, he actually cracked the code and found his grandfather's cache that he was guarding. And this is kind of where Ron Pastore starts off. He starts off looking for the gold and silver in Kansas, and he stumbles upon a family by the name of James there. And there's an old man. They talk about their grandfather. His name was J.M. James. And his grandson had always heard that Jesse James was his grandfather. Well, they actually did a History Channel show on this. And they take the man who says he's Jesse James' grandson and compare a photo of Jesse James at his grandson's age and do the, I guess you call it biometric facial test, everything lined up. I mean, everything fit. And if you think about it, what better place to hide if you're Jesse James than Kansas, the place you hate the most? Nobody's going to come looking for you there. But that's between Bob Brewer and Ron Pastore, I was able to cull enough information to where I believe he did fake his death, and it was his cousin they killed. And Pastore's book, I think it's called Jesse James's Treasure, is a very good book to read, and so is Bob Brewer's book, which is under the title of Rebel Gold now. But in Pastore's book, he makes a very, very convincing case that Jesse faked his death, you know. There's a lot of evidence in there that he did. It even goes as far as the sheriff that identified the body said, yeah, that's Jesse. He had his own motives for saying that. If it's true, it's probably the best crime ever pulled off in the history of man.
Well, Sheriff Crittenden, from what I can gather, was friends with Jesse James.
Yes.
And had actually covered for him for years, which is why the Pinkertons never could discover him, because the sheriff was actually one of their observers, and he was actually, well, I'll give you an illustration of this. The Pinkertons had asked the sheriff at one point to document everybody coming on and off the James farm. And they thought that if that happened, then they would have some kind of a profile that they could use, you know, so they could set up some kind of a trap for Jesse. And so for a couple of years, Sheriff Crittenden kept these logs of comings and goings in and out of the county, and the comings and goings to the James farm. And later he would say that he always documented Jesse James's comings and goings. That he didn't lie, he didn't falsify the report, he didn't, because that's what they had accused him of. They said, well, you know, certainly Jesse has come and gone. And he said, I've recorded every one of his comings and goings. They said, well, we don't see him anywhere here. And the sheriff's response was, he's here. And it would say the circuit rider came to town, the circuit rider left town. The circuit rider visited the wood of James, the circuit rider left the James farm. He referred to Jesse James as the circuit rider. He didn't call him. So the Pinkertons were reading it, and they just thought the preacher was making his visits. But in reality, it was Jesse James.
Yeah.
And so if anything, I think the sheriff was one of Jesse's friends, and no doubt would have helped Jesse fake his own death. It would have solved the problem for both of them.
Yeah, by Jesse killing his cousin, you know, it was a twofold purpose. Stop his cousin from raining heat down on the Knights of the Golden Circle, and his real mission, which was to be storing this money for the renewed Confederacy. And of course, his cousin, I suspect, he thought his cousin would look enough like him that people would think he was actually dead. And the third thing, as I noted, if I were Jesse James, Kansas would be the last place anybody would be looking for me. Given my history, Kansas would be the last place anybody's looking for Jesse James.
And, you know, I would have always thought that he would have gone a lot further west than Kansas. But you had mentioned the facial recognition technique that was used to spot one of his potential descendants. Does the name Betty Dorsey Duke mean anything to you?
Betty Dorsey Duke?
Yes.
I can't say that it does.
I spoke in 2008. I gave the keynote at the James Younger Gang convention, which was held that year in Joplin, Missouri. And I asked them, and some of the, the known established descendants of Jesse James and Cole Younger, of course, were prominent in this event. And so I just flat asked them why they kept getting injunctions against Betty Dorset Duke. I said, why don't you just let her dig up her grandfather? If she's a crackpot, just let her dig up her grandfather and let the world know what a crackpot she is. And Betty died here a few years ago, or else I would have had her on the radio show. But their answer was they were afraid of what she might find.
Mm-hmm.
And what had happened was Betty Duke, her story was that there were some old pictures in her family. And her story was that her grandfather, who actually she knew in the 1940s, was that the story was that he was Jesse James. And when she was, and she just always assumed that that was just a story that they told the kids just because it was something to tell the kids in the family, and none of the adults in the family really believed it. And so when she came to be an adult, she had dismissed it already. It's just one of those things that, they tell the kids.
Yeah, it's so outrageous.
Yeah.
That But
what happened was she came into possession of photo albums, old family photos. And she had a great aunt who was about to die. And so she said she needed to get with this great aunt while there was still someone living in her family who could identify the people in these photographs. And so she got with the great aunt, who identified some people and who gave her some other photo albums, because the aunt knew that she wasn't going to live much longer, and so gave her some even older photos. And so she had come into possession of these photos, and shortly thereafter, her husband had a job that he had to do up in the Kansas City area. And so he was going to be there for a few months, and the company he worked for, I guess, rented them some kind of a house or an apartment. And so she and the kids went up there with him while he was doing this job. And one day she had to entertain the kids, so she takes them to the Jesse James Museum. And she's looking at the pictures. And she's seeing all of her family members in these old photo albums that her great aunt had given her.
Wow.
And so she buys copies of these pictures from the James Museum. She pays them to, make copies of these pictures and to give them to her. And she goes back to Texas, and she goes to Austin, Texas, and she goes to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin, Texas, and that's where she lived in Austin. And she asks them to do photo analysis to determine if these are the same people. I mean, even to the degree that for example, her grandfather, who was supposed to have been Jesse, had a one-armed mother that looked exactly like Zerelda James.
That's quite a coincidence.
Yeah. and so she had some state trooper friends, and so they decided that they were going to play along, and so they did some photo analysis, and they determined that, of course, they were the same people. And then they took a known picture of Jesse. In fact, it's the one that's on the cover of all the books and all the magazine articles, and it's a very familiar picture of Jesse James to everybody. And they scanned it, and then they took a picture of her grandfather that was taken in the 1940s, right before he died, when he was like 101 years old or something like that. And they determined that it was like 99 point whatever percent that they were the same person. But they told her, they said, but we're just the state troopers in Texas. What do we know about this stuff? They said, if you want this to be legit, you've got to take it to the FBI. So she's like, okay. So they sent it to the FBI, and the FBI is like, we don't do this kind of stuff. But, I guess if you want to pay us to do it, they say, we do this kind of stuff, contractually. But, there's not an actionable crime that we're investigating here. But if you want to pay, you can pay. And she paid thousands of dollars for their analysts to do the analysis on all of these photographs. Just as a private matter. And she got the same answer. That it was like a 99 point, whatever percent likelihood that her grandfather was Jesse James, based on the photo analysis. And that other members of her family, uncles, aunts, so forth, cousins, were anywhere from 80 some percent to 99 point whatever some percent, matched to different people in Jesse, in his life, in his family. And so she wrote a book, Jesse James Lived and Died in Texas. And she got a county judge to issue an exhumation order, and she was going to have her grandfather's body exhumed. And she was going to have it DNA tested. And no sooner than she did, before they could get the shovel in the ground, there was a federal judge in Missouri who had slapped an injunction and had stopped it. And so she got a state judge in Texas to override that. And then there's another federal judge comes in and so every time she could get state judges all day long to issue, exhumation orders, and federal judges would just come in and stop them. But she was convinced, and rightfully so, that her grandfather was Jesse James, and the James family was determined that they weren't going to let her find out. But of course, officially their answer was that she was a crackpot, that, she was just crazy,
Well, I don't know if you know this or not. They did eventually do a DNA test of the body there, and they concluded it was him.
Well, they concluded that it was the son of Zerelda James, but that didn't necessarily mean that it was Jesse.
There was news that broke out several years later. Whoever admitted to taking the hair sample, whoever was supposed to have done that, admitted that they got it from the parks director or something. They used a sample of his hair. So it's like every time something definitive tries to be done, implemented, somebody throws a monkey wrench in it. This is a very big deal to a lot of people, and a lot of people get very upset if you even question the official story. Some of them are descendants, a lot of them are. And then there's a lot of infighting between a lot of these people. The infighting's real bad. But it's important to understand men like you and I, we're not trying to wreck anybody's legacy or heritage. We're just seekers of the truth. And if we're presented with evidence that's plausible, we're going to explore it.
Right.
It's not to embarrass anybody or tread upon their family history or anything of that nature. We're just looking for the truth.
But when I spoke at the James Younger Gang convention, Jack Koblis was there. And Jack was actually the one who had arranged for me to be invited to give the keynote. And I met Jack at a Civil War reenactment in Florida. And he was making the rounds to the sutler tables, and he saw mine, and I had a DVD there of a talk that I had given in Texas a few years before at an SCV banquet on Jesse James. And so he bought the DVD, and I guess he took it back to his hotel and he watched it on Saturday. So Sunday he comes back to the reenactment and he wanted to talk to me, and we stood there at my book table for, an hour or so, having a conversation. And then a few weeks later, he called me and he asked me if I would want to speak at the James Younger Gang convention, and I told him I'd be honored. And so he said, well, I'll make some arrangements. And then sure enough, I'm getting an invitation to go speak there. Of course, Jack Koblis at one time might have been one of the foremost scholars, authors, whatever, on Jesse James. And at the convention, he was asking me if I had made any more headway in the book I was writing on Jesse James. I told him, I said, no, not really. And he told me, he said, well, come to my house. He said, spend a couple weeks with me. He said, I'll help you write it. And then I didn't initially take him up on the invitation because I had other things going on. And then when I was able to take him up on the invitation, he was really sick and then he died and it never happened. But I really wish I could have got with and collaborated with Jack Koblis, because basically what he wanted to do was he wanted to all but ghostwrite my version of the Jesse James story. Because he said I had stumbled upon a lot of things that he knew to be true, but that he would have never dared to write himself, because that would have been the end of his credibility as a Jesse James scholar.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted to at least give me a chance to put some of this stuff out there. So I mean, even the experts, if you will, realize that they're involved in some kind of an elaborate cover-up. What the motivation is for that cover-up, I do not know.
I guess possibly income, maybe.
Yeah.
I know. Somehow or another, I came in contact with somebody that was supposed to have a huge collection of Jesse James artifacts. I'm not going to mention his name. But you can, maybe after the interview's over, I'll mention it to you. And you start digging and you realize he's not all there.
Right.
And some of the stuff he proclaims to be authentic have been found not to be authentic. And sometimes you run into good people like you just mentioned, and sometimes this guy started Facebook messaging me. I mean, just really out there stuff. Just, it was almost like he was trying to pick a fight.
Mm-hmm.
So I block him on Facebook. Next thing I know, he's sending me emails. And he just keeps going and going and going. So I have to block him on the email. I was finally able to get him out of my life. But yeah, the guy, he's not stable at all. And he claims to have one of the biggest collections of Jesse James artifacts. And he's been caught selling things that are not authentic Jesse James artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
And he'll make excuses why it is, but that's what narcissists do. They make excuses. It's never their fault. And I believe he's a bit of a narcissist, and but people like that are out there.
Yeah. You talk about Jesse James artifacts. We're up here when we come back from this brief commercial break for the Barnes Review. I'll talk about some Jesse James artifacts, and particularly one that's very near and dear to my heart because I was blessed to come into its ownership. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Jesse James Museum had a fundraiser. And it's amazing the kinds of things that, attract people, and the people who are attracted to Jesse James. And I do not remember her name, but she was a soap opera star from Days of Our Lives. And apparently she had a big collection of Jesse James memorabilia. And there was one particular item that she put up for sale that the museum had, and she put it up for sale. And it was a box. It was a cash box from a stagecoach. And you could see where the lock had been beaten with a pistol and forced open. And she had bought that at a previous. She previously bought it from the museum as a means to help them make money, and then she was donating it back, and they put it back up for auction to try to make some more money in this fundraiser. And the funny thing was you had all these really wealthy people there who wanted to give money to the museum. And so at the beginning of the auction, they're putting up bumper stickers and T-shirts and silly stuff. And people are bidding hundreds of dollars for a bumper sticker. They're bidding thousands of dollars for a T-shirt just because they want to give money to the museum. And by the time the real artifacts came out, a lot of the money people had already left. Or else they just weren't bidding. Because they had already, made their $5,000 bid or whatever, and it was good. So this cash box comes up for sale. The opening bid is $100. I make the opening bid. Nobody bids against me. I've still got it.
That's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet she thought, it's worth a lot more than that, and I'm sure it is worth a lot more than that. But
yeah. Yeah, she had paid several thousand for it when she bought it from the museum, however many years before that. Yeah.
Maybe they should auction that first.
Yeah.
But it would have been bad luck for you.
Yeah. and so I've still got it, and I actually use it as a cash box. Although the cash that I keep in it is collectibles. For example, my uncle was in World War II, and when he passed, it made its way to me, and it's Jew marks from World War II. The Jews were given, there were Reichsmarks, and then there were Jew marks, which were basically, the money that was given for the Jews to spend in the ghettos.
Yeah, I tell you what, that's a whole interesting story in itself.
Yeah.
I guess that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah.
But
and I've also got some bills in there that are Iraqi dinars that still have Saddam's picture on them.
Yeah, I've heard of people having those. And
some old Soviet money that I've got in there. I've got a bunch of the old Cuban money in there. It's all collectible stuff. I've got a couple of silver certificates in there. We talked about Federal Reserve notes in another interview. These were United States Treasury notes, and they say this note is redeemable in gold at the local Federal Reserve Bank or something like that.
I bought a set of 5 for my son when he was younger, and they were dollar bills. The value was a measurement in silver.
Yeah,
they were silver.
Yeah, I've got one in $5 silver certificates, and then I've got a couple of $100 bills that say they're redeemable in gold.
There was a guy in Hawaii that started his own currency, basically. And at first, Alan Greenspan said, yeah, it's legal as long as you don't print legal tender on it. But they were silver certificates you could buy, redeemable whenever at such and such warehouse. I think they were called Liberty Dollars or something to that effect. And
I remember that. And he also minted actual coins. I have some of those coins. Yeah. They were like 1/10 of an ounce of silver, a quarter ounce of silver, half an ounce of silver, an ounce of silver, depending on the denomination of the coin.
And when Ron Paul was running for president the first time, he started printing Ron Paul silver coins, and that's when they came down and busted him. But Greenspan had told him that, it's legal as long as you don't say legal tender on them. And then the next Fed chairman came, shut him down. But I've still got one of those certificates that I had given my son. I got him one of those too.
Well, really, I don't see where those certificates would have been anything more than a check.
Right.
Essentially, the only difference is the check would have been, if you essentially cashed the check, you would have been cashing it for silver, and obviously for that to be legal, for that check to be good, the guy would actually have to have the silver on hand to give you.
Right.
But, assuming that he had the silver to make good on it, I don't see why there would have been anything illegal about it.
Well, I think it was during that time, the dollar was very, very, very weak. And there was a lot of fear that it was going to collapse. So he introduced something that actually had some value that you could redeem. And I really don't think the Federal Reserve liked the competition.
Right.
They like to be a monopoly.
Well, if you remember Christian Exodus, we had a project when I was on the board of directors for Christian Exodus that we actually introduced an alternate currency into South Carolina. And it was a hard currency we had introduced silver dollars into South Carolina. They were actually $10 coins is what they were, because the price of silver was a little over $10 an ounce at the time. And so we minted them as essentially $10 face value coins. And again, it was the same thing as far as the government was concerned, as they did not consider it as far as any type of a forgery or any type of whatever, because they were actual silver coins. In other words, as far as the government was concerned, we were just, passing silver around. And if merchants chose to accept silver in lieu of paper dollars, well, that was, basically as far as the government was concerned, we were using silver as a means of barter. In other words, they never actually saw it as quote unquote money per se.
Right.
And so they left us alone on it. That they probably knew that we were never going to be able to produce enough of this to
give them competition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the main reason that it didn't work is because of that, because we just couldn't produce enough silver to and when people would take the silver coins, they would just hoard them. They would put them in their personal silver stashes or in their collections or whatever. In fact, I still have, I think, 3 of them that I've kept basically for that reason as collectibles. I guess if I ever get really desperate one day, I may sell them as, for their silver content. Right now they're just in the coin collection is just that, as collectibles. But, when people would come into possession of these silver coins, then we're going to go down to Walmart and buy stuff.
Right.
So I don't know that we ever really put any kind of a dent into the economy of South Carolina in that regard. But we were trying to, and the coin, it had the palmetto on one side, it had the South Carolina state symbol on the other side, and so forth. But we were just basically, I guess it did send a political message that we were advocates of hard money.
I've heard of other states doing that, especially when Obama was president. Mm-hmm. I believe Virginia considered it, and I don't know if anybody else did. Now, I have heard of, and this is years and years ago, this town in Vermont printed its own currency to keep dollars in the area, and the federal government allowed them to do it only if, when you exchanged it for regular dollars, it wasn't worth as much as $1. So they had to take a hit on it to keep the money in the local economy.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's still going on or not. But,
so to kind of get back to Jesse James, we talked about the Knights of the Golden Circle and some of the hidden caches. I had read something about that, and the book was called Jesse James Was One of His Names by Del Schrader. And I don't know if you'd read that book or not, but it had linked about that. The best I can tell is at least some of that money ended up in some of those arms, because not only were they robbing, they were, as I understand it, when the Knights of the Golden Circle was robbing trains going west, they were targeted robberies. In other words, they weren't really trying to rob the passengers, but rather they were robbing shipments. There were arms that were being shipped west to fight the Indians. There was gold that was being shipped from mines in the west to banks in the east, and so forth. Silver being shipped from mines in the west to banks in the east. And then there were guns and ammunition, gunpowder, military supplies being shipped from the east to the west for the Indian warriors. And so they were robbing the trains to get the money and the guns for the next war for Southern independence. And when the Knights of the Golden Circle somewhat disbanded in the 20th century, and when they realized the South wouldn't rise again, that at least some of that gold and some of those guns went to Pancho Villa.
Well, that makes sense.
And so Jesse ended up financing the Mexican Revolution.
It does make a lot of sense.
I've heard about that, but the Knights of the Golden Circle, I guess, was kind of an underground Confederate government. And from what I've read, Jesse James may have actually been the treasurer of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
But yeah, they were definitely targeted robberies, banks, trains. Mm-hmm. I had read once that the Northfield, Minnesota raid, the one that went bad for the James gang, that former General Benjamin the Beast Butler, that was famous for controlling occupied New Orleans during the war, he had a vested interest in that bank, and that's why that bank was targeted. Mm-hmm. So it not only makes sense, but it's evidence to back up what you're saying.
You know, when you were studying Jesse, what were the things that stuck out to you?
The KGC connection and what Pastore wrote about. I had no idea that there was the fact that there was 3 Jesse Jameses. Mm-hmm. I'd never known that, and that they were all cousins. I found out about Sheriff Crittenden researching this, how he identified the body and said it was Jesse James, and how he I discovered that he was friends with Jesse, you know, and he was the one that identified the body. And then Pastore goes into a lot of the physical differences between Jesse James and the man they said was Jesse James. Their ears were slightly different. And like you mentioned earlier, one had tobacco-stained teeth and things of that nature, and Jesse was not known to use tobacco or drink. Those are some of the things that surprised me. And then the J.M. James connection in Kansas and the facial recognition that they did between the man that always heard he was his grandson and a picture of Jesse. All pretty convincing things.
Mm-hmm. And so was Jesse James, was he kind of a childhood interest of yours, or?
Man, growing up in Missouri, like I said earlier, the name was often mentioned. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he kind of was a childhood hero, you know. Mm-hmm. There's this legacy of this myth that he was a Robin Hood. Mm-hmm. And you do hear stories, one story in which, and I don't know how true this one is, but an old lady was about to have her farm foreclosed upon, and they were staying the night at her place, and they asked how much she needed, and she told them, and they gave her that exact amount of money, and then went down the road and hid. Well, the banker rides up and is astonished that this little old lady has the money, gives her the deed to her place, which she owns in full now, and at the time he's exiting her place and gets down the road, they rob him again. So if that's true, there are examples where they had Robin Hood moments, mm-hmm. but I think their primary mission was the KGC, Knights of the Golden Circle, and securing money to revive the Confederacy.
Right. Well, you know, if you look at the way Jesse ended the war, he never did. I mean, you know, as the story goes, he tried to surrender, and they basically shot him when he was attempting to surrender.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so, you know, he was one of those, because he had been a guerrilla, because he had fought with Quantrell, you know, he was one of those who was never allowed to surrender.
That's correct, too. A lot of the men that tried to go home were killed.
Yeah. And so so whether he wanted to or not, he was forced to continue fighting that war.
Yes, and then you look at what the Pinkerton agencies did to their mother. Mm-hmm. You know, they rolled a bomb in the house, and yeah. I don't remember exactly what type of bomb, but it was some type of fuel accelerant, I believe. It was supposed to just set the whole place on fire, but whenever it blew, I believe it took his mother's arm off. Interesting side note on that. President Harry Truman had an uncle that was a bushwhacker, a guerrilla fighter. And he grew up with stories about how he became a guerrilla fighter, and that was that the Yankees stopped at his house. You know, he was probably a teenager at the time, mm-hmm. and wanting information on where guerrillas were, and he wouldn't tell them. And so they tied a rope around his neck over a tree limb and, you know, would pull him up and let him down, pull him up and let him down, trying to get him to talk, which he never talked. But when they left, he became a Confederate guerrilla fighter. Mm-hmm. And Truman related that his mother came to visit him one time when he was president. and he showed her where the Lincoln bedroom was. And she refused to sleep there. She said she'd rather lie on the floor. So all those years later, the memory was still fresh to her.
Mm-hmm.
So, but all these things, you're correct. It wasn't really a choice of whether he could give up or not. He was going to have to fight one way or the other.
Right. And you know, and it gives kind of a different appearance because Jesse wasn't just an outlaw.
No.
You think, okay, well, he was a train robber, but he wasn't robbing the passengers. He was robbing the cargo cars. Even some of the stories you talk about the Robin Hood, and part of the reason why the Southern people loved him, even though he was robbing the bank, was, as so many stories go, was the bank robberies were targeted. They knew there was a shipment of Northern gold that was coming through the bank, or they knew there was a certain shipment of money being transferred from a Northern bank or an Eastern bank to a Western bank or something. And they knew what day it was going to arrive, and they knew how long it was going to be there. They knew how much was going to be there. And they would rob exactly that much money, and they would leave all the local depositors' money in the bank. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't stealing from his neighbors. He was just stealing this gold shipment or this cash shipment or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And it puts a totally different perspective on this. In other words, he wasn't just a common criminal. He wasn't just a thief or a bank robber. I mean, he was definitely somebody who was fighting a war. Forget that the rest of the country had stopped fighting it years before.
Well, yeah, it was still a war to him, though.
Yeah. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press Do it today. I'd like to thank Clint Lacy for being our guest once again here on TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. And I hope that as our listener that you've enjoyed today's interview, and hopefully you've had a chance to listen to the previous ones as well. If not, go back to August 17th on the TBR Radio website, and also go back to the 14th of September, and you'll be able to listen to interviews 1 and 2 with Clint Lacy, where we talked about his great book, Blood in the Ozarks, and then about the Bald Knobbers. Go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, and when you're there, sign up to receive my free weekly email newsletter. It's chock full of information that you'll want to read every week. You'll enjoy receiving it. It can come to you absolutely free of charge, no cost, no obligation. And when you sign up for that, I'll also send you a free ebook copy, a PDF copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And those of you who are regular listeners to our program know that one of our friends is John Schneider, Bo Duke from the Dukes of Hazzard. And he's currently in the process of releasing 52 new country songs during the course of 2018. And they're going to appear in a multi-CD set that he's going to call The Odyssey. And some of those songs, I think the first 2 discs of The Odyssey have already been released for sale. And you can go find those at Amazon or at the CD Baby website. But from time to time, John or his agent Alicia will send us one of the upcoming tracks. And here a couple of weeks ago now, John sent me a track that we could put up here. And because we have just a couple of minutes left in the broadcast, we're going to share it with you this week. And we'll finish out the hour with John Schneider singing his new song, Put It in a Country Song.
Yeehaw! I gotta tell you this. Listen up. You know that I got a friend, his name is John. 2 weeks ago he got cheated on. Well, he ain't sad, he's glad she's gone. He put it in a country song. Put it in a song. And I got a friend, his name is Bill. Got screwed by a judge who sits on a hill. He said, I can't pay. He said, oh yes you will. Just put it in a country song. When life gets bad and there's no sunshine, take 3 chords, find some words that rhyme. Tell the world your story in 4/4 time. Put it in a country song. Don't you be scared now, cause I got a friend, his name is Chuck. Stuck in a rut every day he wakes up. Today is the day Chuck's gonna change his luck and put it in a country song. Don't you know that I got a friend, his name is Paul. He met him a girl, she ready to go up a wall. The only night she sleeps is when she don't call. Oh no, put it in a country song. Life gets bad and there's no sunshine. Take 3 chords, find some words that rhyme. Tell the world your story in 4/4 time. Put it in a country song. Play the hair off that guitar. Now I'll tell you, all you girls, don't feel left out. We all got someone we could bitch about. Get on your feet, scream his name out loud. Oh, you got one there. Bergen, what in the hell are you doing? I'm gonna put it in a country song. Hey, when life gets bad and there's no sunshine, take 3 chords, find some words that rhyme. Tell the world your story in 4/4 time. And put it in a country song. Why don't you put it in a country song? All you gotta do is put it in a country song. That's all. Now that was too much fun. Paul, counter up again. Chorus. Hey, when life gets bad and there's no sunshine, take 3 chords, find some words that rhyme. Tell the world your story in 4/4 time. And put it in a country song. Why don't you just put it in a country song? All you gotta do is put it in a country song. That's all.